we are duly informed by the machine that.
All right.
And let's keep it conscious, right? That's the machine. It's a machine. It's not a human.
Well, I don't know if you pay for the premium or not, but I know that it's limited to 45 minutes, but if we need to, we can do a second session. So
I think I'm paid up, but we'll play it by ear. So
cool, man. Good to see you again.
You too, Michael. It's been a minute. Michael is Whisler is kind enough to have me on his podcast on a more than one occasion. And I'm finally starting to do some interviews for my YouTube channel. And he was kind enough to come along and you're actually the inaugural interview.
Sweet. I appreciate it. It's an honor.
Yeah, so we'll jump into it relatively quickly. There's a few sort of lines we might explore. When the last time I was on your podcast, we actually sort of on the latter end of the interview, sort of circled around a controversy of sorts around the role of technology in agriculture, ecology, and all that, and scale technology. And I think drones in particular, you were kind of excited about a particular drone modality, and that elicited a kind of hesitation in my person.
So you're reminding me. Yeah, it's been a little while, but yeah, now that you say all that, I remember what we were talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, we can revisit that, but maybe just to open up, you are engaged in permacultural practices, which from where I stand are really simply agricultural practices, but require the designation permacultural because of kind of unfortunate differentiation from what they involve and what is involved by contrast with large scale so-called industrial agriculture. So, I mean, I could just start firing off myself, but let me just hem myself in and, turn it over to you and maybe just open with that broad blanket question about permaculture. What distinguishes it from industrial
from ag
practices? How does it emerge as a historically distinctive mode of agriculture?
Okay, I like the way you phrased it there. Yeah. So first and foremost, permaculture is inherently horticultural, and it goes beyond horticulture or agriculture or animal husbandry. It's more, as cheesy as it sounds, holistic. Okay. So agriculture.
Can I just stop you right there?
Sure.
Just for the sake of really my own edification and perhaps that of the audience as well. Go ahead and flesh out, even in just a summary manner, the distinction between, say, what is agriculture versus what is horticulture, what is animal husbandry. Those are obviously defining subsets of practice, but I think that their meaning is more or less transparent, but sometimes a distinction, while subtle, the distinction while straightforward, might have a subtle import later on down the line in that conversation. So could you do that as well?
Yeah. So
thank you.
In a nutshell, agriculture, the etymology of the word agriculture, it's the culture of fields. Okay. And it basically, it manifests itself as such. We have these massive monocrops, right? We have huge fields of corn, soybeans, fill in the blank, but we tend to, plant broad acres in a single crop. It might be a apple orchard, acres and acres of nothing but apples. There might be 20 different varieties of apples, but there's only apples. And that is agriculture. Okay. That's the cultivation of fields. Horticulture is the cultivation of plants and, diverse plants. So horticulturists, like in sort of the more contemporary educational spheres. Like I have a friend that went to Purdue University and studied horticulture with a focus in turf management. So he works for golf courses as a greenskeeper, which is technically horticulture. To me, it almost looks like the culture of fields, but turf management, there's quite a bit to it. And it's a subset by some people's standards of horticulture. But when I think of horticulture, I think more about like botanical gardens, master gardener courses, even though I kind of scoff at the term master gardener. You wouldn't call yourself a master poet or a master philosopher.
Right.
And I think gardener should be given the same level of dignity and respect. But that's a horticultural endeavor, taking these kind of courses where you're not learning to grow a crop, you're learning to grow a garden, right? So it's gardening versus what we might think of as farming. But the beauty of permaculture, so permaculture is meant as a what do you call it? Contraction, I guess, of permanent and culture. Okay.
Yeah.
Where
an elision.
is that what you'd call it?
Words together, right? Or
it's an elision.
Call it combination and elision. It's a portmanteau.
Okay.
When you take two words and put them together to form one word. So
yeah, sure.
Portmanteau elision. But go
All
on.
right. Well, hey, I appreciate you educating me here.
My fancy pants on.
So. Well, because it's not a contraction. There's no apostrophe T or whatever. Yeah,
though a contraction is also a kind of elision.
Is that right? All right. Well, there you go.
You're eliding a syllable. So
we're talking about the importance of words here. So this is fine by me. We can flesh this shit out too.
I'm already sort of bubbling, right? Because right from the get-go, the concept of horticulture already suggests a different conceptual relationship to the plant than the concept of agriculture, as you set it out.
I would say almost you could turn what you just said around on its head, where agriculture, you have a more intimate relationship with one plant. With horticulture, with sort of broad view gardening, right? Not farming, but gardening. If we're going to use these kind of words in their typical sense, in order to understand gardening, you need to have a more broad spectrum view. And that's not to take away from, the typical farmer that raises corn and soy, because they're typically highly intelligent, highly capable, very knowledgeable people in their craft. But it's a very sort of narrow scope if you're only focusing on raising a handful of crops versus, with permaculture, with horticulture, we're widening our view. It's way more of an ecological view. So you could also compare it to the fields of biology versus ecology, or, there's 1,000 different fields within the natural sciences, we'll say, but ecology is a sort of all-encompassing field studying the complex relationships in nature, right? It's studying the systems at play, the ecosystems. And permaculture sort of directly comes out of the ecological sort of awakening, where the field of ecology first kind of started. And it really wasn't that long ago. We're talking in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, where this term of ecology as a new science kind of came about. It kind of took from the fields of biology, of climate science, whatever you want, meteorology, geology, hydrology, blah, 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 all of them. Ecology tried to see the connections as opposed to being so reductionist. I think agriculture is highly reductionist, right? Versus horticulture, you're trying to figure out how to fit 100 different plants into one ecosystem as opposed to one plant into a vast ecosystem.
So my temptation is the impression I would I have is that
Mhm.
horticulture and permaculture more generally, though they have as you noted, on one level, a recent emergence, say from like the mid 20th century forward. In fact, and maybe this is me being mesmerized by certain romanticism, strike me as more in line with practices which antedate, which predate, which come before our own sort of civilizational moment.
Mhm.
And my temptation is to say that what we designate as agriculture actually itself is more recent in a structural way. It's not necessarily
Yes.
that much more recent because obviously that didn't start in like 1700. Certainly, agriculture was a medieval practice, and even perhaps you can, I don't know how far back you can push agriculture.
I'll
As,
tell you,
but
about 10,000, 20,000 years at most. Okay. And the human species has been on this planet for, they debate it, minimum 250,000 years, possibly more, if
right.
I'm not mistaken.
No,
There's a good
yeah,
chance
there's a
we've been,
wide range, but minimally that.
there's a good chance we've been here for 500,000 years.
I
So,
I've even heard some people suggest further back than that. But I
right.
mean, the reality is when you get that far back, it's really hard to say. No
So
one
we
knows.
have this, I think we have this broad sort of misconception of what hunter gatherer means. I think it'd be better to say hunter gatherer gardener, because I guarantee, for a big portion of our existence as a species, we not only hunted and gathered, but we also cultivated plants and carried them with us and propagated and selected and, carved out sort of landscapes around us. I guarantee it, for a very long time. For example, I know that North American, natives apparently in this area, in sort of the Midwest, they would carry the best shoots of elderberry from camp to camp, because elderberry is a very easily propagated, easily carried. You take a little root and you put it in your pouch and you carry it to the next camp. And so all these sort of patches of elderberry were planted. They were not necessarily, I mean, it's a fine balance
Well,
between
yeah,
wild
there's
and
also
cultivated.
forest management and things like that.
I mean, there's a lot of misconception when it comes to what this continent was when Europeans arrived. It was not as untamed as they imagined. They just couldn't see it for the landscape that it was. But the idea of permaculture, the sort of originator of the idea was this guy Bill Mollison, and he studied indigenous cultures and tried to synthesize the similarities, right? The common characteristics, the common values. And he came up with, basically, as concise as he could make it, 12 principles. And he called them, the principles of permaculture. And it was, based on these cultures that have existed for thousands of years, relatively, stable. And so, I got into an argument with somebody not so long ago on my show, where they had this like pretty basic understanding of what permaculture was about, but not, even the slightest grasp on the origin of it or the history of it, who came up with it and how. And
So I this analogy springs to mind. Like Bill Mollison,
yeah,
you could say he's the as Bruce Lee is to martial arts. Bill Mollison is to horticulture, and permaculture is the Jeet Kune Do.
I see what you're getting at. And yeah, I mean, in a sense, his goal was to take these cultures and take what he could learn from them and make it digestible to the common person, to the common English speaking Westerner
So
and
there's
beyond.
12
But
principles.
so 12
What?
principles that are relatively, you read them and you're kind of like, well, they take some pondering and some understanding, but they're very simple at their core. So just like I'll try to rattle a handful off, but like capture and store energy. So that could apply 1,000 different ways, but it often, in a permaculture sense, refers to catching rainwater and storing it uphill so we have gravity pressure to water with our, with our uphill storage tanks. It might mean solar electricity. It might mean, storing fuel reserves in case you need them. It's kind of this, there's like a prepper kind of mindset with permaculture. Because what else? I'm thinking about slow and spread water. So aside from storing water as energy, when we release it, we want to spread it out across the landscape. And this is why earthworks are super important with permaculture. Usually when you're applying like a permaculture designer's lens to a landscape, the very first thing you do is you bring in an excavator. And a lot of people would turn their noses up at you and say, oh, you don't know, you're just causing erosion. No, the whole point of these earthworks is to stop erosion. Okay.
Right.
So we carve what are
Take
called,
a step back to take 2 steps forward.
yes. So we disturb the soil first, which may or may not necessarily be a good thing in an ecological sense. It depends on the disturbance. So in ecology, basically a disturbance is an opportunity for change. Anytime, a lightning strikes or a, forest fire rips through or an earthquake happens, trees come down, all this disturbed soil becomes hospitable to new types of life. Good, bad, it's not for us to say. But when it comes to applying a permaculture designer's sort of handbook on a landscape, we love to start by taking anything that's got slope to it, which is everything. There's almost no such thing as a perfectly flat landscape, right? If you think about it, the rain falls, it hits the earth, and if it doesn't get soaked up by plants, it runs off the soil and it goes to the ocean. And it takes the path of least resistance, which over eons creates the rivers, the canyons, the streams, all the waterways that we see. And I know I'm on a bit of a rant here.
No, go.
I'm like talking myself out of breath, but I'm getting at something. Point is, in permaculture, we apply this concept of slowing and spreading water, this principle, where we carve what's called a swale. Okay. A lot of people have heard the term swale. I don't know if you have or haven't, but it's basically a ditch, but it's a ditch on contour. Okay. And if you don't know the concept of on contour, it means it's level.
Oh, okay.
It means it's level across. So, we use our little I'm a carpenter partly in what I do, and I use a level, and it's got a bubble in water. And that's because water wants to spread out across the contour line. So what we do is we dig this swale, which follows the contour line, and it gives, rainwater a place to slow down, to stop, kind of fill up in this berm. If you drive through the suburbs anywhere, you'll see swales. They're just kind of hidden amongst the landscape, but it's to manage all the storm water. So my point is, we slow and we spread the water, and we grow trees and shrubs and grasses, and we graze animals in this environment. And we, apply all sorts of different techniques. There's basically ways of growing food in a very passive way once you get it established. these perennial based systems where it's fruit and nut trees feeding livestock animals, which feed us. That's kind of the ultimate system that we can establish. And it's not so dissimilar from what the Native Americans had. It's just they had more elbow room. There were less of them. And we have to do it in a very space conscious way, if that makes sense.
Yes, it's perfectly coherent. The question then I have is, I do believe that it's fair to assert contemporary industrial agriculture is relatively recent in its origin, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
That's what I was saying, about 10,000 years of
but I'm saying
broad scale agriculture.
that's broad scale, but
Mm-hmm.
I have this impression, maybe I am incorrect, that the way things operate now over the past 2 to 3 centuries, maybe let's say 4 centuries, let's say 17th century forward, um, I think there's a shift in farming practices away from even what was happening, whether in the 13th century or, in other parts of the world and so on and so forth, with respect to broad deployment of mechanization. And also, my impression is that the movement toward monoculture is much more aggressive in the past or in recent centuries. Now, you can disabuse me of any error in that perception.
I think you're generally on the right track. But at the same time, there has been monoculture going back for thousands of years. I mean, Mesopotamia, it was wheat and cereals of various types. Egypt, like they were growing huge fields of wheat. Italy, if you look at the Middle East and the sort of, I guess, Southern Europe, near the Mediterranean, the reason it's so desertified is because it was heavily cropped for thousands of years. It looks kind of barren now. It's because they used up their topsoil. That's why colonialism happened. They couldn't really support their own populations anymore because the agricultural systems were starting to fail. This is my understanding, and I'm sure I'm not 100% accurate, but the general trend that I understand is that, sort of agriculture remained relatively the same until the implementation, like you said, of sort of mechanical advantage, and internal combustion. That was the big thing for generations. It was what can you do with an ox or a horse or a donkey, and then all of a sudden we had tractors, and shortly thereafter we had basically chemical fertilizer as a byproduct of the industrial, the military industrial complex. So the agricultural industrial complex, the food industrial complex, is just a subset of that, where after World War II, these chemical companies that were making all sorts of shit, for bombs and everything, ammonium nitrate and blah, 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 they needed to keep selling their products. And so they figured out that they could take nitrogen and phosphorus or nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. Yeah. And, put it on the fields and double their yields.
It's sort of just horrifying to me to think of how what you're basically telling me is that in order to sustain more or less an economic or a business model which was dependent on military activity, they rebranded the product as something which was serviceable to farming, which means that there's almost like a conceptual indifference to whether or not it's actually beneficial to farmers over any long term. Obviously, it wouldn't have been used so widely if it didn't have some sort of effect. But I mean, the implicit disjunction in terms of the origin and then its subsequent application to agriculture, I must say, is philosophically troubling to me.
Well, it is actually a very interesting like question to ask, one of these typical like chicken and the egg things, but really in America, at least in North America, we had a culture of small subsistence farmers for a very long time, which was a pretty good, system, agrarianism, you might call it. Excuse me. And after, like I said, World War I, World War II, it became a much more mechanized culture. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and
incident,
it
right?
didn't
Kind of
take long for us to get to the
epitomizes.
Dust Bowl. Yeah, because we started overusing the land. With every other form of agriculture, at the very least, when they used up the soil, they recognized that they had used up the soil, and they pillaged and plundered and went and found a new territory. There was like a natural limit in Europe. And then as soon as colonialism happened and industrial agriculture happened, these were a positive feedback cycle that one fed the other. As you could demand more from the land using sort of artificial means, you could overextend your
But it's a devil's bargain.
natural your natural limits. Yeah.
Because you can't actually overextend it. What you're doing is you're inevitably going to lead to more, I'm guessing that leads ultimately to more rapid decline in the viability of the environment,
Well,
thus entering permaculture, right?
it's like cocaine. Cocaine makes you feel real good for a while, and then diminishing returns and the eventual, withdrawal, and that's what we're going through is a withdrawal, or at least we're maybe about to go through.
So, I mean, that raises another set of questions, which I'm going to, so, okay, I'm not going to lose that point because it's a very important point, but we kind of got off track slightly, right? Not really, right? Because I was asking,
We're laying the tracks as we're
laying the
doing
tracks,
it.
right? So permaculture is conceived in the early 60s by Mollison.
More
And
like the 70s, late
70s.
60s. Yeah.
So it's sort of related to the emergence of ecology.
Mm-hmm.
Now, within ecology, you sometimes hear this distinction between social ecology and so-called deep ecology.
So I was about to actually bring up deep ecology. I'm impressed that you've heard about it, actually.
Well, where I have my sense of that distinction is from Murray Bookchin. I don't know how familiar you are with Bookchin.
I've read some. I know I have.
He
But
was an anarchist who was important to early ecology and preeminently a social ecologist, where he notes by social ecology that economic and then agriculture and horticultural conditions are intimately connected to the conditions of society.
mm-hmm.
Right? The nature, there is no true pristine nature. There's a second nature. Nature is constructed.
And there's no economy outside of ecology.
Right. This is all connected.
Mm-hmm.
But he came to a kind of hostility toward what was called deep ecology, because deep ecology became associated with a sort of aggressive, what I call philosophical misanthropy. Deep ecology wanted to negate human being as the problem, that we were the root of the apparent environmental and ecological problems that began to emerge in the and proliferate in the 20th century, late 19th century forward. and that what really needed to do was just take the human being out of the equation. And
I think that's a misrepresentation of deep ecology.
well, I mean, it's a, so, I mean, I'm asking,
Possibly,
not
possibly.
asserting anything
Yeah.
in an adamantine fashion. Maybe, I suffer from a misconception.
Well, it's not entirely a false representation in that there are people within that thought who definitely are misanthropic and who blame people. I think so. Really, it's a direct line of connection from the first ecologists to deep ecology, which was a more spiritualized and like radical view. But to me, from what I studied, it really was a simple recognition of what it really boils down to two principles: deep ecology, radical interconnectedness, and radical interdependence. And a lot of the sort of what I would say is maybe a slightly misguided, doomsday minded environmentalist brain of the 70s and 80s were definitely drawn into the deep ecology sphere, but they didn't, to me, define it. Like deep ecology, when you really got into it, you also recognize via sort of these permaculture ideas, which came from deep ecology. You recognize that we may be a source of many problems, but we are also the greatest potential agent of change for improvement, right? We can degrade soil over generations and we can rebuild it over one, which is pretty cool. By applying permaculture principles, we can undo hundreds of years, thousands of years of damage in a couple, decades. So to me, very optimistic if you follow it to its logical conclusion. And it's funny how anarchism is folded in with a lot of these thinkers. It's like my favorite author was pretty misanthropic. I still love to read him, but Edward Abbey, he
Monkey Wrench Gang.
Monkey Wrench Gang. He was in some ways credited with spurring this sect off from deep ecology, which they referred to as, they called, they referred to themselves as eco-saboteurs. The media called them eco-terrorists, right? But it was all kind of, there was sort of a germination point.
Well, I think the affinity probably is, the affinities are multiple. The one that stands out to me most predominantly is I would say the intuition that no system should be trusted. Even if it's a well-intended system, the very fact of its systemicity condemns it to failure. Reality exceeds all strict formulation. And the only antidote to the limitation of system is the exercise of intelligence in the face of specific context. This, of course, is a perspective which is inimical to, hostile to, adverse to established authority, which latter, I would say, almost needs system to legitimate its claim and promulgate its claim. So it follows that ecological and anarchist principles will be closely knit into each other.
It's a recognition of the inherent complexity and the inability to manage it all. That's why I love how permaculture is just based on these simple principles that basically it's like little cheat codes of how can we work with nature, how it's already intended to, to exist, and sort of accelerate the productive capacity while simultaneously not only conserving soil, but building soil, actively building soil. That's what it all boils down to, because, soil and water is life. And
So
if we have,
why, can I ask you, why is not, like when you say this stuff, I like, you should not, who's going to disagree with this, right? Okay, no one's, I mean, I find it difficult to conceive of someone saying, hold on there, Whistler, your gospel permaculture. Okay, I just, because it all seems almost truistic to me.
like too good to be true, right?
Not so much too good to be true as so commonsensical as to defy the practices in any way controversial. So so this is my question then. Why is not permacultural practice more broadly implemented than it is?
Well, I'll turn the question on its head and say that it's becoming more, like, steadily. It's become apparent to me. Where I live, I drive north of Indianapolis, and I'm starting to see swales in cornfields. If you pay attention when you're driving on long, highway stretches through the Midwest, you'll see these big ditches carved on contour, and they stick out because the corn, fields are still straight. And these are big, sort of relatively like shallow swales, so that the tractor can still kind of do its thing. But the principle is being applied of slow and spread out the natural rainfall, because, these cornfields over time develop these gullies, these washouts, these, eroded waterways. And so farmers are waking up. Soil conservation is common sense stuff, but it's slow to be taken up fully on a broad sort of basis, because it's not immediately profitable, right?
Right.
This is one of the big failings of capitalism in my mind. Even though I don't view capitalism as a dirty word, I think it's been kind of sullied by corporate megalith, monstrosities who wield our sort of natural systems with the benefit of state power behind them. I'm off on a tangent here, I know, but
That's not actually
natural local capitalism, free trade, call it what you will, but sort of voluntary exchange with the use of money for goods and services, when left to its own devices, when not manipulated by the military industrial complex, it has these natural ways of solving problems and creating the most efficient means of doing things on a local basis. I don't know if you're following me here, but
well, I follow you. As you might anticipate, I have some reticence about that character.
Well, so let me finish the thought then, because my point is that if we had a less adulterated corporatocracy style of capitalism, if it was a more locally based economy, as it has been historically for generations, for eons, we would be using more of these principles more immediately, because they're very applicable to somebody trying to produce a lot on a small piece of land, relatively small. They're less applicable if you're interested in counting beans and using up the land as quick as you can for the quickest buck you can, right? This like capitalistic in our modern culture, this urge to always, quarterly earnings have to always be going up, that doesn't account for the natural rhythms of nature, right? That is not pure. It is an artificial, like, imposition of this goal that if we don't produce as much as we did last quarter, something's wrong, everything's going to shit. It's like, no, some years you make a little more, some years you make a little less. Every farmer knows this, but mega corporations do not. So to try to balance the scales in their, bean counter little, accountant workshops. They have to squeeze as much corn and as much soy out as they can year after year with no regard for the future. And it's dangerous.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's dangerous. I mean, part of the challenge here is terminological. What does one mean by capitalism?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And you are, as I hear you, going to suggest that this problem of scale is a corruption of capitalism, whereas I would say it is a feature and natural outcoming of a specifically capitalist protocol. Now, when I say capitalist protocol, what I mean is the injunction that economic activity is driven by the disbursement of capital with the objective of reacquiring and then expanding that capital so that it can be dispersed again, reacquired, and expanded again. And capital is a mode of commodity which is epitomized in money. Mm-hmm. So what you have in effect under this mode of production, to use classically Marxist language, is a circumstance where the relationship between the use value and the exchange value of any given commodity is actually inverted in terms of its significance, so that food is no longer produced in order to feed people. That the food can feed people is a precondition of its sale, but one which is almost lamented by the capitalist. I'm saying the conceptual capitalist, not like an actual person, right? The capitalist system is interested in the production of food and its sale only so that it can acquire more money.
Well, because it is money. Because it is money.
Money is the name of the game.
There's a reason they love grains and beans. They call them bean counters for a reason. I hope I'm not cutting you off.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to distinguish a capitalist mode of production or an economy from one where you just see small scale voluntary exchange. In fact, under capitalism, you retain an illusion of voluntary exchange, but it is in fact largely an illusion, because what's driving the whole process is the logic of the system, the logic of the exchange, not the logic of what people actually need. In an agora, agorism, right? In an ancient market, or you can still see it today in certain parts of the world, there's exchange, there's conversation, there's haggling, whatever, okay? But there's retained the primacy of human relationship. I mean, you can romanticize a little bit, but at the end of the day, part of the reason why Africa didn't shut down during the madness is because their markets are closer to that older model, and aren't going to obey the dictates of some goddamn bond traders who want to suppress general demand so as to paper over their sins, right?
Well, truly, I believe in the agora. Right. And maybe my use of the term capitalism is, it's like,
I mean, you're using it in a colloquial sense.
Yeah.
In an open-ended way, where I'm bringing a more technical definition to the table, which might seem a little stodgy. And if it does, I apologize.
Well, I almost just see agorism as like the purest form of capitalism. And maybe, again, like I'm not as well read or well informed as some, but that's my definition of sort of
there, right? I mean,
free and open exchange, right? The agora, let's use that word.
Right.
Like the biggest, I think, driver of these poor land management strategies is the crony connection between sort of the capitalist interests and the government power. If there was not that connection, then things would rise and fall at a much more natural sort of progression, and better practices would be found quicker. I mean, in terms of agriculture,
they need to be found, they just need to be implemented.
We've found
the problem is our relationship with time under.
Yes, but in terms of,
and actually, it also. I'm sorry, I don't want to.
That's okay. That's okay.
I just want to point out one quick thing that also has to do with the project of modernity itself, the specific way in which science becomes configured by modernity as directed to the domination of nature.
Yeah, you have my agreement there. To me, it's a cultural problem primarily, where we've lost the value of looking forward 7 generations. You know, we've forgotten that it's not just about you, and it's not just about your kids. It's about your kids, theoretically. And so, you know, in terms of economic philosophy, it all is secondary to me to, like, you know, I've said before that I almost feel like anarchism's the philosophy, permaculture's the practice. Now, what the spiritual, you know, component of that is, I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can fill that blank in with whatever you so choose, but I think it requires like a third leg to that stool, where it's like, you know, the understanding of the infinite complexity of systems, the recognition of anarchism, of agorism, of allowing people to manage their own lives, just like you let any living, natural, wild animal manage its own life in a free and open way.
Right.
You know, until the day comes where you know your interests outweigh your respect for the squirrel or something that you want to eat, or, you know. But I'm getting lost on something there.
No, well, I mean,
but like, nature
it all
is
fits
brutal.
together.
Nature is brutal. That's what you know, it's brutal, it's beautiful. The balance of it's not just tooth and claw and like predator prey. There's so much of what is known as mutualism, you know. In terms of ecology, that's how I explain things, is I try to go back to ecological principles. In terms of ecology, there's really only 3 types of relationships in the natural world: predatory, predation, and mutualism. So it'd be you know, basically to say that if any 2 organisms are in a relationship, it's either beneficial to one and kind of like neutral to the other, or negative to the other, or it's symbiosis of some kind. It's everybody wins. And that's an oversimplification, but
because there's always more than 2 species involved.
Yeah, because it's a web. It's not a string. Yeah, it's not a food chain. You know, whoever said the food chain, they were limiting our thought. It's definitely a web, a radical web. But yeah, like I was saying, I guess I really do think we need some sort of like spiritual component to like guide our morality, because it's not enough to have the philosophy and to have the practice. You've got to have, like, it's not just the what and the how, it's also the why.
Right. We need something to bring life into the equation. Because if it's merely conceptual, you're going to have a hard time evoking the energy which is required to actually bring it into the world. I think that the missing term, like you said, is fundamentally transcendent. And it strikes me after wise that what we're wrestling is the limitation of secularism. The secular rejection of a transcendent element actually truncates our relationship with the world in its fullness. It only wants to relate to the world in terms which are amenable to quantification and control.
Sort of material thought, material
In my
objectivity.
reading,
Yeah,
but there is and in part it's intensity and its rejection of transcendence is an outcome of the historical situation from which contemporary secularism arose, where you had these wars of religious strife, as we are taught, that stimulated an intense contempt for religiosity as fundamentally delusional and as propagating violence and bad ways of relating to the world. Of course, what that really is a very large problem of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. By rejecting the religious dimensions of human life in such a stalwart fashion, you have short-circuited the human capacity to relate with the world more broadly. Well, how do you do that? How do you reconnect to the question of transcendence? It's very hard at this moment because of how thoroughly we've been conditioned to be secular. Even those of us who participate in a religious tradition are often hamstrung by the impression that to assert something with religious conviction is to become exposed as childish or silly or something like that, and is backward and superstitious. And it's a situation where I don't have a solution. It's almost as if we have to wait for the solution to emerge on its own, and that is not an acceptable outcome. Great, right? It'd be great
Yeah,
that like happen, okay, but there's an urgency to what is unfolding in the world at the moment.
I was going to say, do you really even want that? Like, do you want a new religion to emerge? Because can you even imagine?
I wouldn't put it in those terms.
Well, that's what it almost sounded like to
But
me, right?
and that's fair that you say that. I suppose what I want, it is paradoxical, because there's two things that I think you can derive from a solid relationship with the transcendent. One, ironically, I say ironically, there's the two terms of humility and confidence. Okay.
Yeah.
Humility, because you realize how minuscule you are in the face of the cosmos. The cosmos. Not just that it's big beyond the capacity of our mind to grasp. It's more than merely big, right? It is infinite. But you also realize that you are a child of that infinite. And there's got to be something right about you if you're here. You have a capacity to positively inform the unfolding of the infinite. Yeah, I know that sounds all woo-woo, right? But I don't, that's just where I am. And if it's woo-woo, so be it. What I really want is people to realize their radical self-sufficiency. That's what I want, Michael. But under a secular dispensation, a human being is just a collection of chemicals and electrical processes. And if that's what you're told you are, it's hard to get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm being a little unfair. And I will accept that I'm being a little unfair, a little polemical in my characterization, but I don't think it's far off the mark.
Well, I'll be honest, man. Like I've been finding Christianity more and more interesting. You know, I was raised a Christian, but like just in certain ways, and I find Taoism to be very interesting too. But like, I almost think, so hypothetically, let's say we need these three pillars. We need the the philosophy, the practice, and the spirit. And that spiritual component, I think, can be filled in different ways, but I keep coming back to duality as like such a major unspoken and like barely understood force of nature, right? Duality. I mean,
What do you mean by duality?
I was
Because
gonna
that
ask
word is used
if you,
variously. So
yeah, so in my mind, like the short, sweet definition of duality is equal and opposite. And that's a paradox, right? In my mind, like how can something be equal and opposite? But there's infinite examples, maybe the most obvious one being a magnet. They're one and the same. It's a magnet. It is one magnet, but it's got two polar opposite sides with opposite charges conducting their own work, right? And so when I think of duality, I think of like,
is polarity perhaps a better word?
no, well, polarity would be an example of duality, but like, man,
I guess it's contrasted with dualism, which is the assertion that there are two kinds of substances constituting the universe. But that's not what you mean.
well, maybe it is what I mean, man. Maybe it is what I mean. Like, I think the singular truth of our world, of our universe, very well could be that there is duality in everything. And this is a concept that I've struggled with for like a few years now. And I wish I could come up with like good, solid examples for you, but it just seems like no matter what like topic I'm diving into, whether it be sort of, like lately I've kind of been addressing like the male female dichotomy, two sides, same coin, right? The male female energies. And that's
Yes,
just one example,
right.
but equals and opposites, right? We are
Right.
not the same, but we are equal, and we are, we're not the same, but we are the same,
I would almost,
which is radical, right?
right. Paradox. It's paradoxical.
It's paradoxical, but I
Right.
believe it can illuminate a lot when we're struggling with these inherent contradictions, right? Like, what if the answer is both? Like, yes, and, you know,
Right. Well, I agree with you. Like I'm both and not either or.
right.
Excuse me.
Must be catching my secondhand smoke over the internet. Well, you got a real fit going now, don't you?
Sorry there, man.
Hey, just work it on out, man. No big deal.
Yeah, I'm all right. I had that, personal level, I sort of encountered that similar question. I was years and years ago, I was dabbling in some martial arts and got a book on Tai Chi Quan, and in the back, there's just an appendix. And at that time, I really hadn't had any exposure to Eastern thought.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the appendix, it talked about the principles of yin and yang. And I was like,
That
oh,
is
Lord,
that. I
it
mean,
makes so much sense.
that's the
Right.
symbol of dualism, of duality,
And
right?
right,
Right.
but you'll know that like that it's important that they have that in the in the black portion of the
There is some light in the
black,
dark and some
right.
dark in the light. Yes.
So so that's to Taoism or what have you is I don't care if you call it Taoism or Taoism.
It's either or.
It's
which
because
is perfect,
they,
because it's both and,
yeah, right. So, the T, but anyway, yeah. So, um, but you see, if you had a greater culture, and we should wrap it up here just for time's sake, right?
Sure.
Even though we didn't draw any finance, I think we had lots of useful reflections. But uh, one thing which we really didn't discuss this, but a problem in our moment is a problem of conversation
Mhm.
because there is such a apparent divide along ideological lines that have been sort of really rigidified over the past 2 to 3 years. It was already there.
Mhm.
And in the wake of the the COVID event, or whatever you want to call it, I consider it absolutely awful and fundamentally one of the worst things to transpired in human history. I think is a massive deception.
Mhm.
Massive deception. Difficult for me to exaggerate the extent of deception involved.
Yeah, well, the biggest the planet's ever seen. Yeah.
But uh, if our culture had a greater appreciation of duality, of paradox, of the fundamental manner in which truth is a sign of truth is that it participates in both poles of any given proposition,
Mhm.
then you may have a greater capacity for these lines that have been drawn to become more porous and a cooling off because we are coming to a threshold of cultural conflict that I think should be fundamentally unnecessary and I don't think would be beneficial in its outcome for anybody, really.
Mhm.
Whoever the quote unquote winner is, there would be no winner, there'd be just losers. So I think that your
Uh-oh.
perception, sorry,
It's okay.
of a greater appreciation for dualism as essential is quite apt. I mean, do you have any thoughts along those lines? Or do you want to
Yeah.
elaborate?
Well, it's like, okay, it's like, yeah, they want us to see the division, and we see the division. It's there. I'm not going to say it isn't, but there's a dual to that, and it's the convergence, which I've been participating in, I believe. I just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, went down to Tennessee for the Self-Reliance Festival, which was an interesting blend. I've been to it twice now. I actually spoke there this time. And it's an interesting convergence of the more like prepper, like doomsday, like sort of what you might think of as generally conservative minded folks, and the more like hippie, back to the land, like um
Burning Man,
Burning Man. Yeah, I mean, they're people from, I mean, those are
Hippy
just two,
Dippy. They're not. It's just I'm
those are
using
just
the
two categories, but like, of course, it's a whole matrix of different types of folks, and everybody's converging on this idea of we need to build resilient community, we need to start producing food, we need to set up local systems of commerce, we need to be able to operate outside of their economy and function within our own agora. And so I think that's just what we need to do. It's like we can get all caught up trying to solve it. We're not gonna solve it. It's like, again, like duality, man, like Taoism, they say it's like the art of not trying, right? Like Yoda says, like to Luke Skywalker, he says, do or do not, there is no try. There is no try. Like do or do not. And so it's about what we do and what we don't do. very simply put. And so I think it would be helpful if more people had a grasp of some of these concepts, right? But like, I think this conversation's been helpful because I almost do think in my advocacy, I'm going to boil it down to 3 ideas. I think I already have, I just hadn't quantified it. But anarchism, permaculture, duality, because I think that's fairly all encompassing in my mind, as far as how to progress, like as a functional framework.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that the framework becomes this. You said this already. Really, the framework that you're suggesting becomes powerful in terms of action, and then action in the real and the concrete world. Don't become manacled by the concepts. The concepts could be useful, but ultimately it's about what you do. As you said, you do or you don't do. And actually, those are both important.
Well, yeah, like sometimes it's best to do not, right?
Right.
If what you might do is something bad, perhaps you should do not. Like, yeah.
Or even sort of more, or even just the fact of silence is a decision at times.
True. Stillness.
Not just like a silence of refraint, but just a silence of surrender.
Yep.
Set. Let the being up well within you.
Well, maybe the missing component of duality that I hadn't really considered much, but is the neutral area in between, right? Like I've heard of this concept of positive chi, negative chi, and neutral chi, where, like positive is the pro and, negative, is the anti, like the against, but neutral is like stillness of like, stopping and staying.
Well, it's the emptiness, it's the void within which these things swim, man. Yeah.
We're a couple of hippy dippy motherfuckers, man. But
your kung fu is strong.
Hey, the force is strong with this one.
Man.
But yeah, no, I think it's good shit, man. Like these are the concepts that we need, because like it's easy to, people are like just swimming, they're overwhelmed, they don't know what to do, and like I think it helps to simplify it,
And I think there's a lot of fear.
Yeah.
And that's like a whole other song and dance, right? But all this stuff about these energy crises in Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We go on all day about it. People have to reawaken a sense in their capacity to lead their lives without relying on these structures that are drawing them into these ridiculous, unnecessary dramas that have vital stakes.
Yeah.
People's lives are on the line. It's not just, and that fact itself is a scandal that goes underappreciated.
I feel you. Yeah. It's like people say, oh, maybe we should just move on. Well, that's easier said than done. No, we need to move forward, but I'm not moving on from anything. This is all, I'm not going to
it's an important distinction. Moving forward is not moving on.
Yeah.
Forgiving is not necessarily forgetting.
Bingo. Bango.
Which isn't to say that you don't forgive, but it also means that you don't indulge the repetition of errors already perpetrated.
Agreed. Well, I tell you what, man, I would love to, well, first I'd love to plug my book. Did you know?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Go right to it, man. Sorry.
That's cool. I got it right here. Haywood 2029 by Michael T. Whisler. You can get it on Amazon. It's a just real fun book. It's a novel, kind of semi-future, not too far in the future, but sort of I don't know. I'm not going to give too much away, but it's a fun tale. It's an adventure. It's, you know, a commentary on everything. It's written sort of from my perspective, but highly fictionalized. And yeah, Haywood 2029. Get it on Amazon. And the Easy Peasy podcast. I was gonna say, man, I remember, I couldn't send you video because it was such a huge file, but if you can find a way to send me the audio, I'd be happy to share this and plug your channel while we're at it and all that.
See if I can figure that out. And and I'll put links in the description wherever I put this. Put up on YouTube. I'll probably also put it up on Odyssey, and we'll see wherever I can get it up there, I'll get it up there.
So. Well, I might be able to even download it from Odyssey or something. I don't know. But yeah, we'll see if we can work that out, because I'd like to share it as an episode of the Easy Peasy podcast too. I think it fits the vibe, but yeah, I'm glad we could do one for you this time either way.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, man.
All right, I'll let you go.
All right.
I'll be in touch here shortly.
Sounds good, Tom.
Hey, have a good night.
You too.
Bye.
Recording finished?
I think so.
Yeah, it still says recording up in my little corner.
Let's see here.
Have you done this before on
No,
Zoom?
it was my first time doing it. So
Yeah.
hold up.